But the idea of that Christians were roped in along with the Jews is already predates Severus, right? So, and the interpolation in Tacitus might already have happened by that point, right?
Yeah.
So this is a long time. So like when Severus is looking at the text, he might be looking at an interpolated text. No one had any idea that the Neronian persecution was connected to the fire at all. And even Revelation seems to have no idea that that existed. So even the author of Revelation has never heard of this Christian persecution. It's reasons like this that some scholars are suggesting that maybe Tacitus made it up, right?
Right.
Because all the outside evidence is that this never happened, right? The Christians were never punished for the burning of Rome. And then going back to the beginning of this question is like Pliny has no knowledge of it. But that's not the only one. Like you stack it. Like all these people, even Christians don't know about it. Jews don't know about it. Like pagans don't know about it. Historians don't know about it. Legal authorities don't know about it. Like so there's all this stuff that shows that persecution never happened.
I freaking told everybody that if you join the Patreon, you get to ask your own question to the experts, especially Dr. Richard Carrier. And so, look, the Jerusalem gates were open and they're closed, and those on the outside are stuck with the dogs, which tells you how people thought of dogs at that time. Kidding, of course, but listen, join, support us. I have a question from one of our supporters, Roland. Thank you, brother, for making this trip possible, actually. Dr. Richard Carrier, welcome back to MythVision. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. I love being in studio and being able to do that live.
Thank you for being here and making the trip down here to Florida where I'm at. I have a question. I have several questions. Specifically, Roland made this trip happen. So I'm taking more than one question. But for the Patreon members, we have a few questions that have rolled in.
Good, yeah, excellent.
Awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
First question's a little long, but I'm going to do my best. Yeah. Pliny, letter to Trajan, 111 AD. Pliny was a pen pal of Tacitus and admired the historian. He was very well educated. He was an equestrian. How do you pronounce that?
Equestrian.
Equestrian senator, quaestor. I got the name right. Praetor, prefect, suffect, consul, and augur. Everything under the sun.
Yeah.
Therefore, he must have been aware of the fire of Rome in 66 AD and its aftermath. Even though Tacitus wrote his Annals in 116 AD, 5 years after the letter to Trajan, where he uses the term Chrestianos. And if I'm saying that, Chrestianos? Cool. For those who were blamed by Nero and who were punished in an immense multitude with the most exquisite tortures. So I'm going to read that again, Aaron, just to say, for those who were blamed by Nero who were punished in an immense multitude with the most exquisite tortures. One would assume this was something every educated Roman would have taught. It seems strange that Pliny is not aware of the existence of these Christiani, nor does the Emperor Trajan. At a minimum, Pliny would have mentioned, those hordes of depraved, superstitious people that caused so much trouble 50 years ago? Well, it seems they are back.
Yeah, remember, it's worse than that because it's basically their 9/11, right? Because it's the arson of Rome. Like Rome burned. It was basically like dropping the towers, right? It was that big a deal, right? So do people forget that? You know what I mean? And they, not only does Tacitus say that the Christiani were blamed for it, he even throws in a line that says some of them were guilty, like they confessed, right? Like they admitted they burned Rome. Now that might have been like forced confession, yada yada. But the thing is that's what he's saying, right? So yeah, like you said, how could you possibly forget this, right? So this gets into the question of okay, wait a minute now, has Tacitus's passage been tampered with, right? That's a whole side question. The questions being asked right now, though, is how could Pliny, who's not only is Pliny Tacitus's best friend, they wrote and exchanged correspondence specifically on the history. So Tacitus would literally write Pliny letters for advice to include things in his history. So they're talking to each other. And Pliny's super excited by his histories, and they're sharing advanced manuscripts and things like that. So so that's going on, right? And so you think Pliny's writing 110, 111, Tacitus is writing 116. He's probably writing the Annals during this period, right? So he publishes 116, but anyway. So you have all of that. And yet when you look at Pliny's letter, he says, I don't know who these Christians are. I've never attended any trials. I don't know what they're guilty of. What am I even doing here? And Trajan writes back, yeah, it's kind of not a big deal. Don't really chase him down. We don't really care, right? Like, so like that's kind of the exchange, that's a really weird correspondence if they're like known as these like 9/11 mass murderers, right? You think like that would be the thing. So that gets into the question of Tacitus. But in terms of like Pliny, well, what's going on there, right? Like the thing is, and Pliny, and that's the point of all that long list of all of his duties. The augur is he's actually in the he's high level pagan religious apparatus. He's like a leader in that. He's a priest basically, and he was basically the attorney general of Rome, and he was like co-president of the empire, and he's all that you could list all these things that he was. This guy, and he was a governor of multiple provinces, right? And it's like he'd never heard of Christians before and doesn't know like he has some idea of the rumors about them doing something, but he has no idea what they're guilty of or whatever. And like, how can that be, right? That's the question, right? How is that even possible?
Yeah, you brought up the 9/11 thing. I've always, that's a really good example because of the conspiracies that Nero did it inside.
Yeah,
it was
that's
the
right.
US.
Yeah, listen, they had fucking truthers. You are not wrong. That's absolutely right. Yeah, it's totally true.
Can you imagine someone referring to 9/11, even if it was, let's say, decades after? They would constantly think of Taliban. Okay, like anyone who knows anything about it would know to refer, even if they said.
And it would be the same, like how Islamophobia rises out of that. It's like, oh, Al Qaeda did it, therefore all Muslims are evil, right? Like that.
Yes.
So that you would think that would be Pliny, right? He'd be like, oh my God, these people were accused of being Christians, these like infamous arsonists and murderers, and like that letter would be totally different, right? And so the takeaway from that. There's a couple takeaways from that. One is it means what this reveals is that Christianity was not successful. It was not well known, right? Like, so like if this guy, the guy who has the most legal experience that you could possibly have in the whole Roman Empire for decades, if he had never even attended a trial of Christians, he just had the vague rumors about them. Well, that means that Christians hardly, like just barely even existed, right? Like they're just they're just straggling, hanging on. And this is like almost 100 years after the religion started. So it shows you that the religion was not as gangbuster successful as people often claim, right? So, or the Book of Acts, right? Okay. So that's the first thing, and that also means that when the movement is slow and straggling, it means it's highly susceptible to capture and distortion, right? So it's very easy for mythology to become victorious because the number of people who are still around who are going to gainsay any of it are gone, right? They've left, or they don't care, they're dead, So the ability to like turn this into Scientology like goes way up, right? That's the kind of thing. So that's a part of it to look at. But the other part of it to look at is that this becomes evidence that Tacitus has been tampered with. Because one of the things that this is another thing we know about Pliny. This is Pliny the Younger. Now, Pliny the Younger is the adopted son of Pliny the Elder. Was essentially raised by him, and he's biologically his uncle, but adoptively his father. And they took adoption seriously back then. Yeah, like the father is father, right? So he is his father in that sense. And so and Pliny the Younger loved his dad's stuff and was his publisher, right? So like he even published his books posthumously. One of the things he published, the history of Rome, posthumously, because he even says in the preface, "I'm leaving it to my heir to publish." Who's that? That's Pliny the Younger.
Yeah.
And Pliny the Younger loved his books, read all his books, read all his notebooks and all of that. So like there's no way he's going to just not read this book that he's publishing. That is this famous thing that was like the capstone of his dad's career. His dad was so proud of this. Look, obviously he's going to read this book. And this book, Pliny the Elder was there in 64, right? So like he would have been an eyewitness to this fire. Absolutely, there'd be a whole chapter on it, right, of this event. So you would think like that's where like Tacitus's main source of information would be. And we know Tacitus used Pliny the Elder's history. That's one of the major sources that we suspect that he used and indicates that he used. So like that means that the note about, the Christians should have been in there. And if it's not in there, well, now you run into a problem. So there's actually some historians now who are claiming. So my claim is that there's a line that's been added that the line about Jesus it doesn't say Jesus, but Christ. That line was added later. We'll get into that in a minute. But there are scholars who say that no, it wasn't, but Tacitus made it all up. So Tacitus basically created by himself at that time. It didn't exist before. There's no legend of the Christians being persecuted for the fire of Rome. Didn't exist as a thing. Tacitus made it up. And then no one noticed, so that all the subsequent history of this doesn't have any. All the Christians wrote whole books about Nero's persecution of Christians. They have no knowledge of the fire argument, right? So there's no knowledge of the fire of Rome or the arson charge or any of that. This kind of like this is all evidence that stacks and stacks on top of like, well, I don't know about this. Like, how could Tacitus make it all up and no one notice? No one uses it. No one needed to argue against it. Like, it's just no one even knows it exists, right? This argument. It seems more likely, is what's more likely, is the line about Christ who was crucified under Pontius Pilate or whatever, or executed, he says, that line was a marginal note, like a gloss. We have a lot of these examples of little glosses like this that gets incorporated into the text as a later scribe thinks it's accidentally omitted text. So it gets inserted into the text sort of accidentally later. And so it becomes not a deliberate interpolation, but an accidental interpolation. We have tons of examples of this happening. It is a common thing in manuscript studies for all authors, not just Christianity.
But just so I'm tracking you, you're saying even if you don't grant that this is interpolated accidentally, you're still going back to Pliny the Younger, still going back to Pliny the Elder.
And the question we're being posed is how then, even if you would say that Tacitus made it all up and nobody noticed, how then would Pliny not know about it, right? Because they're buds, they're sharing manuscripts and stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So even Pliny, his whole career of whole friendship with Tacitus, all the letters they wrote, the sharing of manuscripts and all of this, like Pliny had never heard it from Tacitus. Like how could Tacitus have made this up and his friend not know about it, right? Now maybe say, oh, well, Tacitus made it up later or whatever. But anyway, it's a really convoluted hypothesis. It's a much easier hypothesis to say that line wasn't there. That when Tacitus wrote this, he is repeating what was in Pliny the Elder's book. Pliny the Elder probably did write a text about how the Christiani were blamed for this, and some of them confessed. And I'll bet that whole section in Tacitus is from Pliny the Elder. Like, it's probably straight out of his history. But if that's the case, then he's talking about Christiani, not Christiani. It's not Christians. It's more likely, this is my theory, it's more likely he's talking about the rioters under Chrestus. So there's this movement we know from Suetonius about there was this guy in Rome named Chrestus under Claudius, and he started these riots, right? And then the Jews were expelled over this, right? So it's something to do with Judaism. Some guy named Chrestus, he's in the reign of Claudius, so it's after Jesus, like after Jesus is dead, right?
Which doesn't match the gospel.
Right, yeah, so it doesn't match the gospel. He's also in Rome, right? And the name is different, etc. Like, there's a lot of apologetics.
Rome. I mean,
yeah, there's a lot of apologetics to try and roll back all of this stuff. Like, oh, well, Chrestus might be a misspelling. Oh, well, but Rome might be a confusion. Oh, well, all of that, right? But no, if you just read the text as written, it's obvious it's a guy named Chrestus. He's clearly some sort of Jewish instigator in Rome in the 40s, AD, and he started the riots, and the Jews were punished for it, etc. But that means that we know that there's a group who were loyal enough to a guy named Chrestus to fucking riot in Rome. Yeah. And they were legally expelled for it. So this was a recognized, quote unquote terrorist organization, Yeah. So what do you have? Like 20 years later, or 10, it was 10 or 20 years later, you've got, I think it's less than 20 years for sure. But anyway, so it's like 10 years later. Now you have them being blamed for the arson of Rome. Well, that's a convenient scapegoat. If people remembered this terrorist group that caused this tumult, that got the Jews expelled from Rome just 10 years before, and Christiani is how you would describe people who are in the political party of Chrestus, right? Supporters of Chrestus. In Latin, they'd be called Christiani, right? And Tacitus says the people called them that, which is, that means it was just an appellation, right? So there's people talking about the people that Chrestus would drive to riot, right? And so that's one explanation, is that the Christiani were just Christiani, like the followers of Chrestus. That means they were Jewish agitators, had nothing to do with Christianity. So this whole thing had nothing to do with Christianity. And we have a sort of support for this when in the 4th century, someone forged a whole bunch of letters between Paul and Seneca. And Seneca is this famous Roman philosopher who was also alive at the time of the fire. And there's in one of this whole forged correspondence, there's this exchange of letters about the fire at Rome, right? And the way it's framed in the letter, this was invented roughly around the time of Eusebius, and it's notable that Eusebius also has no knowledge of this fire argument, right? This persecution, this whole event, it's not in Eusebius. He never heard of it. So that's also evidence that maybe it wasn't there, right? So you can stack these things up. But anyway, someone forged this stuff, and in the letter that's forged, it describes that the Jews were blamed for the fire, right? It says the Jews were blamed for the fire, and some Christians were just roped in being thought to be Jews, right? So it wasn't like targeting the Christians. The Christians just got accidentally sucked up in this. It's like ICE going around and arresting everybody, and they're sucking in people who are actually illegal residents and being sucked into the illegal, because like, we're going to go get the criminals, and they go fucking rope in all these innocent people and stuff. So like the argument of the letter is that like they were going after Jews, they blamed the Jews for the fire, and the Christians just got accidentally roped in. Now, whoever wrote that clearly had never read the Tacitus passage either, but you can see the thinking. So they might have read the original Tacitus passage, or even Pliny the Elder's book, because it would have still existed then. And they would have said, that it was the Jews for this. So the author of this forged letter is, okay, yeah, so we know famously there's this group of Jews that burned Rome, or were accused of it. And it would make sense if the Christians got sucked in, right? So they invent this idea of Christians getting roped in to create a dramatic narrative for this epistolary correspondence. So you see the idea growing, like the legend is growing. And then by the time you get to Severus, Septimius Severus, like, like 50, 60 years later, well, now he's just outright saying the Christians were burned for the whole thing. And so, but he doesn't exactly quote Tacitus on this. But the idea of that Christians were roped in along with the Jews is already predates Severus, right? So, and the interpolation of Tacitus might already have happened by that point, right? Yeah. So like this is a long time. So like when Severus is looking at the text, he might be looking at an interpolated text, but he might not even been. He might have just been assuming it was Christians because he's following the forged correspondence of Seneca and Paul, right? And saying, oh yeah, it said the Christians were sucked in. And so like that becomes part of his version of events. So you see the legend grow, right, over time. So all of this evidence stacks to suggest that when Tacitus originally wrote, he was talking about a different group, not Christians, and that line about Christ wasn't there, right?
Isn't it also fair to assess that, like, when I read the Apocalypse of John, I mean, this thing is so blatantly talking about Nero, and anyone with a little education reading this would have said, look at what Nero, he's a beast, which they have this in oracles. There's Jewish writings that are talking about this. Roman writings that call him a beast. And you sit there and think to yourself, man, there's so much propaganda against Nero. Christians are writing as if they're being persecuted by him. Why not just add the fire into the scene? See they're like connecting dots as time rolls by that don't necessarily, because you point out in your upcoming book, everyone, it's on pre-order, got to get it. The obsolete historical,
the obsolete paradigm of a historical Jesus. That's the new book.
Got to get the book, but you point out that there's no fire in Rome. There's the hope that Rome is.
It's in you cite Revelation. The author of Revelation also has never heard of this persecution. Right. For him, the Revelation describes the burning of Rome as a punishment against Nero for the supposed persecution that he did. And the persecution we know is that's another growing legend unrelated to the fire, because there's First Clement sort of says a thing about Peter and Paul being killed that could easily be mistaken as saying Nero killed them. It doesn't say that, but it's easy to see how someone in their mind could think that that's what First Clement said. And then by the time we get to the 2nd century and we have legends of the Neronian persecution, we have whole books to talk about this. We have Tacitus, or Tertullian talks about it. But their version of the persecution is like just Peter and Paul are crucified or killed or whatever by the state, and for some weird political reason. But it's not for the burning of Rome. There's no burning of Rome has no connection at all to this persecution. No one had any idea that the Neronian persecution was connected to the fire at all. And even Revelation seems to have no idea that existed. So even the author of Revelation has never heard of this Christian persecution. It's reasons like this that some scholars are suggesting that maybe Tacitus made it up, right? Right. Because all the outside evidence is that this never happened, right? The Christians were never punished for the burning of Rome. And then going back to the beginning of this question is like Pliny has no knowledge of it. But that's not the only one. Like you stack it. Like all these people, even Christians don't know about it. Jews don't know about it. Like the pagans don't know about it. Historians don't know about it. Legal authorities don't know about it. Like so there's all this stuff that shows that persecution never happened. And so a lot of historians will agree, actually we should probably say that persecution never happened. But now you have to explain the text of Tacitus, why is it there? And so then you get to the whole thing, well, then maybe that line was interpolated, right? Maybe Tacitus was just talking about Messianic Jews. And so for him, to call, even Chrestius might have been, let's say he was someone, let's say it isn't a spelling, let's say it really is Christ, but it just translates Messiah, and it's like a Bar Kokhba thing that we forgot about. It's like some other dude that people were hailing as the Messiah, and it started riots or whatever. That's not Christians, right? It's just ordinary run-of-the-mill Messianic Jews, maybe Messianic Jewish extremists, right, or whatever, but they're not Christians. It has nothing to do with Jesus. And so there are scholars who suggested that the Christiani are actually just ordinary Messianic Jews, and this is a confusion that people took, because you could say like Messianists in Latin would be Christiani, right? It would be the same word. So the idea of the Christians being a distinct version of this Messianic movement gets lost in the noise, right? Like, so it's easy to confuse them, especially if you're an apologist. But even Christian apologists didn't confuse them until the 4th century, when you get this whole forged correspondence, and even that confusion was more of an inference than an actual confusion. So it took all the way to the end of the 4th century for the confusion to be complete, and to just say, oh, Messianic Jews means Christians, therefore Tacitus recorded, the burning of the thing, it was a persecution for the Christians, etc. So the legend becomes fully formed by the end of the 4th century, but as you go back through the texts, you can tell that legend didn't exist. It wasn't in Tacitus, and everybody knew that was just Messianic Jews. It had nothing to do with Christianity. And so, and you can see that even in the stories that Christians wrote about the Neronian persecution, that even they agree that had nothing to do with the Christians. It was they claim that there was some other thing that got Peter and Paul killed. Even that might be a legend and made up too. So that's a whole other side story. But yeah, when you get into this questioning, you look at Pliny's letter, it opens this massive can of worms. The question is, that's why that question is really good, because you start asking, that is really weird. And so you do really hard to try and like rescue the text, right? Like you want to rescue the Christian version of history. And so you research and you check and you research and check, and just every freaking domino falls. Like all of it just falls apart, and you go, okay, hold on. Like at what point do we call it? Like what point do we say that was made up, and that was actually later made up, and that Tacitus never said this? He never actually said that the Christians, in terms of the followers of Christ crucified by Pilate, he never said that's who the group was. He said it was somebody else, and it was an interpolation of the text later that sort of turned it into this, right? And so like all the evidence stacks in that direction. And I have a whole section of a chapter on this in my new book where I talk.
Now, this isn't necessarily for critical scholars, but if you take that logical conclusion for the believing Christian today, that doesn't look good for your people, okay? Like if they're trying to intentionally burn down Rome from mid of 9/11 and first century, anyway, that's
well, the Christian story is that they were falsely accused, and so the confessions would have been forced confessions. Now we don't actually know that, because there's another direction you can go with this. Yes, you can say that, well, the Christians did, like we have 2 Peter, right, that talks about the universe is going to melt or whatever, like the new death is going to come by fire, because God said he'll never drown us again. So what's left? What's left is to burn everything.
We'll
right?
start the apocalypse.
That's right. Yeah, the apocalypse will be by fire, and this had a connection to like Zoroastrianism, its influence on like Stoicism and stuff. Like that's where this comes from. This idea that it's going to be fire, right? So let's say, hypothetically, like I want to be clear, we don't have any documents saying this, so this is purely speculative, and this is not what I think happened, but it is entirely consistent with the evidence that we have, is that you have Christians who've been told over and over again, like Paul's going around telling all these Christians everywhere, the world's going to end, it's all going to melt, it's all going to be burned up, and we're going to fly up into the sky, and Jesus is going to meet us in the air. Like that's 1 Thessalonians, he says. First Thessalonians 4, he says this. And so okay, so now let's say you're getting frustrated. It hasn't happened. It's not happening. It's not happening. Like Paul's dead. It still hasn't happened, right? Like,
and the Lord went in, according to their teaching, went into the temple to cleanse it. So he's taking proactive.
That's right. Yeah. The temple's still there. Like the end hasn't come, right? And so like you can imagine that there are some extremists. Let's say they're like heaven's gators, right? Like the most extreme of the Christians, and even other Christians like, dude, you're going too far, right? Which we know can happen, right? Exactly. We know there are Christian nationalists. We know there are Christian militias. We know there are Christian Nazi organizations, right? So so you can't impugn all Christians with it, but it does exist, right? There are these extremists. Same with Islam. Like Al-Qaeda does not represent all Muslims, right? So we know that you can have these passionate religious movements that can generate these pockets of radical extremism. And so let's say we have these radical extremist Christians, full-on Christians, believers in Jesus, the whole thing. And this is compatible with Jesus being historical too, let's be completely clear. And so they get this in their head, well, it's supposed to come by fire, and they get it in their head, well, then we need to usher it on. And so they deliberately burn Rome, hoping that this would basically summon the apocalypse, right? Like this is an entire, like the logic of terrorists. This would totally make sense, right? So they don't do this. And so you could come up with a plausible narrative of it. I don't think that's what happened. I don't think it's true.
But it could. It's
That's right.
consistent
Yeah.
with the ideology.
That's right.
Look, Roland, you're the man. Thank you so much, Dr. Carrier. Join the Patreon. Help support our mission here of bringing these ideas out there. Being critical, skeptics, checking out the ancient world and trying to figure out how did this stuff begin and where do we go from here. Thank you again.
You bet.